Okay, so thank you. Okay, okay, so thank you to the people from the Mahabodhi Society for inviting me to in this last leg of my trip to Northern California to visit your center. I've visited several times in the past, and I know some of you join my regular Wednesday evening meditation program. Even when I'm not there, Elizabeth puts up the recording of my instructions so that people could follow even in my absence. And so for this talk this evening, I chose as the topic living a life rich in meaning. Because I think this is a problem that many people are facing today is finding some sense of meaning or purpose in their life. Like in earlier aeons in traditional cultures, people had a sense of purpose, which was pretty much prescribed to them by the dominant beliefs and traditions, customs, the general overarching worldview of that particular culture. And so people understood their place in the universe, whether it's a traditional Christian culture, Buddhist culture, Hindu culture, Chinese Confucian culture. So everybody shared a general worldview, and people had a sense that their lives were rooted in some kind of higher meaning and purpose. But one of the effects of sort of the scientific revolution, I don't want to knock science, this has brought countless benefits to humankind. But one of the consequences of the scientific revolution of the 19th and 20th centuries is that it sort of knocked away any sense of a transcendent purpose to human existence and any sense of a, maybe call this a transcendent essence or core at the heart of human life. So people came to see themselves as being just physical organisms, bodily organisms that had emerged through the process of biological evolution. We're just, in essence, we're just physical bodies. According to some theories, the mind, consciousness is just a byproduct of material processes. And the belief dominates that when the body perishes at death, mind, consciousness comes to an end, and nothing exists beyond death. And so when you take this perspective, even if you don't sort of consciously formulate it as a philosophical belief, but you just absorb it from the dominant culture, you come to see yourself as not having any ultimate value, and you don't see human life as having any ultimate value. And so, what do you do then? So, then you have to set yourself as your task in life just to surrender to we call worldly desires. And so, some people take as their aim in life just the pursuit of wealth, just to earn as much money as possible to become. In the old days, when I grew up, the aspiration was to become a millionaire. Now it's taken for granted that you become a millionaire. So now you want to become a billionaire. And even if you get $10 billion, it's not enough. I hear that in circles of people living not so far, stone's throw from this Mahabodhi center, there are people who are worth probably $20 billion, $30 billion. Even we have somebody who holds wealth amounting to 200 billion, 300 billion, 600 billion. And what's interesting is that the question is like, what do you do with this wealth? Why do you continue to pursue so much wealth? And it seems that that accumulation of wealth really adds no value in itself to one's individual life, but the wealth is just an abstract figure that one has to continually escalate to drive to higher and higher levels because increasing the wealth increases one's sense of self-worth. So the value of one's life in one's own eyes depends on one's accumulation of wealth. And so this is why in some cases when there's a crash in the stock market, an economic downturn, people maybe lose a lot of their wealth, then they just plunge into despair, and then people sometimes commit suicide because their whole life is determined just by the numerical figure by which they evaluate the worth of their life. So I would say that that is, from my perspective, it's a life which is rich, but not a life that's rich in meaning. It's a kind of empty life based upon the inflated idea of my value consists in monetary wealth. And it's a little bit of an insanity since often the people who accumulate so much wealth don't use it for any beneficial purpose, but just keep on hoarding their wealth. Okay, so that is one kind of pursuit in life. Another goal that people set for themselves is sensual pleasure. So this is the ideal of the hedonist. Of course, they might need wealth in order to be able to enjoy sensual pleasures, but for them, the aim is not wealth in itself, but you use wealth to be able to acquire and to enjoy lots of pleasures, whether it's sumptuous food, luxurious homes, trips to exotic places, and people also become addicted, especially men, to sexual enjoyment, taking many partners, using their wealth to attract partners. And this becomes sort of a pursuit in life, which once they reach the age of 40, 50, then the capacity to enjoy that kind of pleasure starts to decline. And then they come to feel empty. And perhaps life starts to become meaningless for them. So we have wealth, sensual indulgence. Other people seek power and fame. So this is sort of maybe the political portal to meaning in life. One wants to climb the scale of political position until one gets to the top. One comes to it. Lower positions till one gets to the top. And of course, if it's operating within the democratic process and one can use that political position to benefit the country, to benefit the people, then it's fine. But sometimes we get into a situation, I won't mention specific names, where somebody gets into a position and power, and that becomes the obsession. So everywhere they have to broadcast their name, buildings have to be named after them, um, institutions have to bear their name. And so in this case, power becomes an end in itself, and the whole meaning of their life is rooted in their ability to exercise power over others. And so when a point is reached when either they're elected out of a position of power or when they're subordinates, for them to sustain the sense of meaning and power, other people have to submit to them, to abase themselves in front of them. Even the people in power will insult others, their subordinates, denigrate them, fire them when they're not completely compliant with their wishes, as we've seen in recent times. And so there's this obsession with power as giving meaning in life. And power is closely connected with fame. So maybe people not in the political field, but in the field of entertainment or sports seek fame to become the most famous musician, artist, actor, actress. So fame is a goal in life. So these are the types of goals that people, with the sense of a transcendent meaning or purpose in life, is obliterated. Then people set themselves these worldly goals, which they pursue, and they're never really fulfilling. There's always some inner sense of emptiness, a sense of voidness, a lack of fulfillment, which can never be quenched by the pursuit of these types of goals. Because these pursuit of these goals, we would say, is based on a wrong view, a misunderstanding of the proper purpose of life. And it's all rooted, probably these pursuits, in an underlying grasping of the sense of a substantial self, that self which has to acquire more and more wealth to elevate the sense and expand and solidify the sense of self, or to indulge in more and more pleasure in order to gratify the cravings of that sense of self, or to acquire power and fame, again, to glorify that deluded sense of self. And so, from the Buddhist perspective, how do we pursue a life that is rich in meaning? And there's a little verse that comes in the Dhammapada that I think shows the contrast between two different approaches to life. I just copied it down just before we had this gathering here. So I'll read it first in Pali. It goes, Asare Sara Matino, Sare Cha Asara Dasino, Te Saram Nadi Gachanti, Micha Sankapa Gochara, which means those who conceive of the essence in what is non-essential, and to see in who perceive the essential as being not essential, they do not acquire the essence because they are in the grip of wrong thoughts, wrong views, wrong thoughts. Then comes the contrasting verse. Sarancha sarato nyatva, asarancha asarato, te saram adigachanti, sama sankapa gochara. So those who know what is essential as essential, and to know what is not essential, what is worthless or valueless as not essential, they acquire the essential, achieve the essential, because they are in the range of right thoughts. And so from the perspective of having right thoughts, right views and right thoughts, how do we find what is truly essential, that which will give us a sense that we're living a meaningful life, a life that's rich in meaning? And there's an interesting observation about the Pali word. The word is in Pali atta, A-T-T-H-A, and the Sanskrit equivalent is artha, A-R-T-H-A. And this word has several layers of meaning. One of the meanings is good or benefit. And so when you seek some benefit, something which is good, what you're seeking is atta or artha. And atta also means purpose or goal. And so when the Buddha is instructing his disciples, he says, strive for atta, strive for the goal. And the word atta, another sense of atta is meaning. So the word atta can mean good or benefit, goal or purpose, and meaning. So it's when we have a goal or purpose that we're able to achieve some good or benefit. And the good or benefit that we are seeking is what gives meaning and value to our lives. And so I found a sutta which I like very much. It's in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the Book of Fives, and it's sutta number 47, where the Buddha speaks about 5 kinds of wealth. And I think he's speaking to lay people, to householders who, of course, for them, acquiring wealth is an important dimension of their lives. And so he enumerates the 5 kinds of wealth. I'll enumerate them and then elaborate upon them. The 5 are faith, then virtuous conduct or sila, and third is generosity, fourth is learning, and the fifth is wisdom. And so those are the 5, and now I'll sort of explain them or elaborate upon them, as the text gives brief definitions of each of these. So the word that's translated as faith in Pali is saddha. I think this is the Chinese shin, fourth tone shin. And so some English translators don't want to use the word faith, maybe because coming from a Christian background, the word faith sort of cuts against the grain of their thinking, that they're sort of breaking away from Christianity. And so they use maybe trust or confidence as a rendering for saddha. But since I don't come from a Christian background, I prefer the word faith because the word faith suggests it has an emotional component that the word confidence is lacking. And faith suggests that one is relating, connecting one's life to what I would call a center or source of transcendent value, a source of value that lies beyond this sensory conditioned material world in which we're living, the world of everyday affairs. And the way faith is defined in the sutta, it says that the disciple places faith in the enlightenment of the Buddha. It's not simply placing faith in the Buddha as a person, but one has faith in the enlightenment of the Buddha. And then it expands on this. One has the faith that the Buddha is the Arahat, fully enlightened one who possesses clear knowledge, good conduct, the 9 epithets of the Buddha, which we'll be exploring tomorrow. But the key point is that one is placing faith in the teacher that we call Gautama or Shakyamuni as a Buddha, and he's a Buddha by virtue of his enlightenment. And his enlightenment is, at the deepest level, it's the realization and the embodiment of the unconditioned, which is Nibbana, the deathless element. And so one sees with faith, one sees the Buddha not just as a human being, so of course the Buddha is a human being, but one sees the Buddha as the one who sort of brings down the unconditioned element, Nibbana, into this conditioned world, the one who's fully realized that unconditioned element, who's incorporated it into his very core of his being, and who lives in the full realization of the unconditioned, the deathless, the transcendent, and then makes that reality accessible to humankind and to other sentient beings. And so the Buddha is among the qualities, he is the Sata Deva Manusanan. He's the teacher of deities and human beings. And he's the one who enlightened himself, enlightens us, and serves as the source of countless blessings through the power of his paramis, his fulfillment of the spiritual perfections. And so when one has faith in the Buddha, one has faith in the enlightenment of the Buddha, that means one takes the attainment of enlightenment or the realization of Nibbana to be the goal of one's own life. Even though we might be very foolish, ordinary people, maybe don't have very high levels of virtue, high levels of meditative realization, but we start off with this faith, and that becomes something which completely reorients our life. So like, taking my own example, just a useless drifter or college student, taking courses, different subjects, going to parties. At a certain point, then I felt that no real meaning in my life. What is the meaning of my life? What am I doing with my life? And then just about that time when I was sort of immersed in that kind of existential questioning, then in the bookstores and bookstore in Brooklyn College, I came across some books on Buddhism. My curiosity was aroused. It's not that I immediately became a Buddhist, but the interest persisted for a couple of years till when I went to graduate school. Then I met the second, I entered the graduate school in September 1966. And then the second semester, a Buddhist monk from Vietnam came to study in the same university and to live in the same residence hall where I was living. It seems like just suddenly everything came together. And before long, I'm going to visit him in his room and learning some Buddhism from him, getting instructions in meditation. And then a few months later, a crazy idea comes into my mind. I want to become a monk myself. So then my life took on a meaning. Okay, so even though we might be not highly spiritually developed, but when you get faith, that gives some direction to your life. You're now moving towards some kind of what I call as a transcendent goal. And even though it will take, because in Buddhism, we believe in many, many lifetimes, many existences within the round of repeated birth and death, but we set ourselves that aspiration, that determination, even that vow to attain Nibbana, to realize the ultimate, the unconditioned. And different schools of Buddhism, you could do it as a bodhisattva vow to achieve Buddhahood, a vow to achieve arhatship as a disciple of the Buddha, in some cases, rare cases, a vow to attain enlightenment as a Pacceka Buddha. But whatever the mode, the vehicle one is traveling in, one is moving towards that ultimate goal held up by the Buddha, the state of transcendent liberation. And that comes initially through faith. Of course, sometimes we have to test the faith. We undertake certain practices to see how they work in our lives. So it's not a blind faith, not that you just completely dispense with your critical faculties and just blindly accept anything your teacher tells you. But you sometimes have to be with ordinary teachers, sometimes keep a very keen and sharp critical faculty to see whether their teachings correspond to the teachings we find in the scriptures, whether their practices or whether their instructions are valid, whether their practices actually work. But we start off with some degree of faith. We put the teachings we test the teachings in our experience. And as we test them, then if they're valid teachings, authentic teachings, then we see that they bring benefits to us. We get the etta, the benefit, the good that comes from the practice of the Dhamma, and then that will strengthen our faith. So our faith becomes stronger until faith becomes, at a certain point, sadindriya, the faculty of faith. That is where faith becomes a controlling force in our life, so that our whole life becomes sort of governed by that faith and motivated by that faith, by that aspiration, that vow to realize, to bring down that transcendent truth, transcendent reality into our own life, into our own mind and heart. Okay, so this first factor in these 5 kinds of wealth is faith. And then based on faith, then sort of one takes the initial step in practice is sila, which means in practice initially observing precepts. And so this is where you're starting to modify your conduct, the way you conduct your life, the way you interact with other people, with the other factors, forces, commitments in your life, to regulate them in accordance with certain ethical principles. And so initially, at the very foundation, the most basic level, we undertake 5 precepts. So these are the precepts to abstain from killing, taking life, or physically harming or abusing other living beings. The precept to abstain from stealing, from misappropriating the property of others. The precept to abstain from sexual misconduct, from transgressing against the partners of others. The precept to abstain from false speech, and the precept to abstain from the use of intoxicants. And so, from one angle, the precepts seem to be like to have negative formulations, abstaining from this, abstaining from that. And that has a very important effect on our lives, because so much harm, when you undertake the 5 precepts, you're restraining the forces of the mind that are responsible for so much harm, damage, destruction, misery, and suffering in the world. Just if you open up any news channel on the internet, I mean, the first thing you see is this country, Israel, bombing Lebanon, United States in some tense relationship with Iran, threatening to obliterate Iranian civilization, 5,000-year-old civilization, Russia bombarding Ukraine, Africa, the Sudan, one party against another party. People are starving because of these conflicts. So much violence. And so, not to speak of all 5 precepts, just everybody in this world were just to observe the first precept, the whole world would really be transformed overnight to a world of peace and beauty and mutual help and prosperity. And so, even though the precept seems negative in its formulation, but the impact would be tremendous if everybody observed this. And often we think of stealing in terms of people committing burglaries and robberies at the level of sort of a gross level, but so much stealing takes place that we call this white collar crime, you know, cheating in the stock market, cheating in manipulating currencies. Um, so really observing these precepts would have transformative impact on the world, but most of all, it has a transformative impact in the first instance on our own life. So we don't have to think that, okay, this will never be the case that everybody is observing these precepts. But when we observe the precepts for ourselves, we find that it brings a kind of deep peace, contentment, inner satisfaction within our own minds and hearts, since we know that we are bringing our conduct into accordance with these principles. And these ethical principles flow from what I would call the world sustaining Dhamma. So we have the world transcendent Dhamma, which is the path to liberation, and the world sustaining Dhamma, which is the principle of goodness, righteousness, and virtue that ideally will hold the world together. And so when we observe these precepts, it's not that we're just conforming to certain moral laws that are being dictated to us, but we're bringing our conduct into harmony with these principles that flow from the underlying ethical foundation, a kind of transcendent ethical foundation of the world order. And then corresponding to these five precepts, the negative formulation of the precepts, a certain inner virtues will start to emerge and grow stronger as we observe them. And so take, for example, the precept of abstaining from the destruction of life or from physically harming others. So that is a principle of restraint or avoidance. But corresponding to that, we find in the suttas, the text says that the disciple dwells kindly and compassionate for the welfare of all sentient beings. And so when you observe that precept as a negative restraint, at the same time, one is nurturing the quality of kindness and compassion in the heart. When one takes the precept to abstain from stealing, then one recognizes the need to be honest, to develop that quality of being honest and trustworthy so that others will trust you with their belongings. And so that one becomes a person of strong moral integrity. When you observe the precept to abstain from sexual misconduct, then you learn to develop the quality of restraint, restraining desires, and remaining faithful to one's own partner, and developing maybe a very close, deep, loving relationship with your partner based on mutual trust and respect. When you observe the precept abstaining from false speech, then you make a commitment to truthful communications. Of course, truthful speech done wisely according to the appropriate conditions, but you build up this core of truthfulness within yourself. So others sort of pick up your vibrations when you're strongly committed to truth, and people will respect you admire you and trust your word and even turn to you for advice because they know that you are a person of integrity whose word will be truthful, honest, and then abstaining from intoxicants. Then you build up a clear, calm, sober mind. And so you're gaining these five inner virtues, which are the counterparts to the five principles of abstinence. So in this way, you're getting a life which is enriched in meaning. Of course, you're building up the qualities of compassion, honesty, faithfulness, truthfulness, and sobriety. You're becoming a person of a strong moral fiber, a very solid moral character. And that is a beautiful achievement in itself. Even if you don't go into deep samadhi, high states of meditative realization, when you have that solid, firm, ethical character, that becomes a source of benefit for yourself. You're able to benefit others. And in terms of the law of karmic cause and effect, you're creating the conditions for favorable rebirths in the future. Okay, then we come to the third kind of wealth that the Buddha speaks of. Ironically, this is generosity, which means that you use your wealth to help others, to benefit others. And so the text goes on to say that the noble disciple dwells at home with a mind that delights in giving, delights in sharing, a mind that's dedicated, free from the stain of miserliness, which delights in sharing and giving with others. And so when you have wealth, of course, you don't want to you can't completely squander your wealth, give it all away, unless you're one of these great, munificent people who is about to go forth and become a monk. We read about them sometimes in the commentaries, and then they pile up all of their gold and silver into one big heap, and they invite everybody from the countryside to come and take what they need, and then they go forth and become an ascetic. But we can't all do this, but we should devote a certain amount, whatever percentage we have to determine for ourselves, to give to worthy causes. And this can be, from the Buddhist framework, we use a certain amount to support those who are living the lives of renunciation, to support monastics with, they say, the traditional requisites of robes, food, dwelling place, and medicines and medicinal requisites. So that becomes a source of great merit and benefit. But also one should use one's earnings, one's wealth in charity to help those who are needy. And what I did, maybe many people know about this, years ago, I established together with my friends and students, we established, there was really a shortage of Buddhist humanitarian organizations, very, very few compared to Christians and Jewish and Muslim organizations. So we established the organization Buddhist Global Relief to address the problem of chronic hunger and malnutrition around the world. So we started 2008, 18 years ago. And then just with 3 small projects we started, and now we have 60 projects in countries around the world, from Mongolia to Southeast Asia, India, Sri Lanka, African countries, South American countries, and the United States. And so this way we're able to help people emerge from poverty, hunger, malnutrition. And so giving is a very important virtue. And what you find when you practice generosity is that it brings, is sometimes you have to fight against an innate tendency to cling to one's wealth and possessions. That's a sort of natural tendency. But when you start to give, you find it creates a space of joy and happiness in the heart. That you're starting to weaken the tendency of grasping and clinging and opening one's heart with concern for others out of the wish to benefit others. And when you do that, then you feel great happiness and joy. Like for my publications, from wisdom publications, I get royalties, and I've never kept a penny of those royalties for myself. Every year, when I get the royalty statement, I just divide it up amongst many different organizations. Sometimes there are other Buddhist organizations, but other like organizations working to address climate change, organizations providing assistance to the poor, to maybe to some schools for the Native American Indian children. And I feel so happy when I just dispose of all of those royalties, not a penny is left. I should keep some for medical expenses. Okay, so generosity. So when you practice generosity, that is a kind of wealth that gives meaning and happiness to your life. And as we'll see, when you observe sila and generosity, then you reflect on them, not to build up your sense of ego, not to think, oh, I'm a person of moral virtue, or I'm a generous person. But when you reflect on that, it gives happiness and joy in the heart. And that joy elevates the mind and becomes a supporting condition for samadhi. Okay, so these three, faith, sila, moral practice, generosity, are the qualities that I say help to form one's character or one's virtue. Maybe in Chinese, this would be Buddha or Gongda. Gongda is better. Gongda. Buddha is more like merit, but this is Gongda. But the next two are concerned with 智慧.
智慧. 智慧.
智慧. That's what, did I say that?
Yeah.
Wrong tone?
No, not Cantonese.
智. What tone? Yeah. 智.
Wait, yeah, both of them are.
智慧. 智 four tones. Okay. So first comes learning. So now we're sort of getting into the heart of the Dharma, sort of going into the ocean of the Dharma. And so to enter the ocean of the Dharma, we have to start off like you're going into the ocean. So you're on the beach and you have to start off with the little steps into the water. You don't want to go out in a boat and jump into the depths of the ocean, but you start off by starting to learn the Dhamma, take some basic texts, courses in order to acquire this quality of learning. And in the sutta, when the Buddha explains learning, he lays out a systematic process of learning the Dhamma. Probably this was intended primarily for the monastics, but also lay followers can follow these steps. But they're a little bit different in a literate culture than when the Buddha was speaking in a culture where there's no written text. So you have to always learn the Dhamma orally from a living teacher. So we have 5 steps in learning the Dhamma. The Buddha says you have to listen to teachings, listen to a lot of teachings. So the expression comes lending an ear, turning your ear towards the teacher. So in this case, you go to hear discourses on the Dhamma. And there's a different flavor when you hear the Dhamma from a living teacher or you can even get through discourses nowadays through the YouTube on the internet, but you're still getting it in the form of discourses. Somewhat different flavor from just reading the text in a book. Was you're getting almost like a personal transmission. You're picking up sort of the spiritual vibrations of the teacher, and the living spirit of the Dhamma comes through the words of the teacher and the gestures and manners of the teacher. And so you listen to the teaching, then you retain the teachings in mind. And in the Buddha's day, people had because they were not dependent on writing, so the capacity for memorization seems to have been much stronger than in our present day. So nowadays, the way to retain teachings is to write them down, to take notes. So it's always good, especially when taking a systematic course in the Dhamma. Maybe not just a little Dhamma talk like this one, but any kind of like systematic program of instruction to take notes so you're able to preserve the teachings that you hear, to have them on later occasions, to review them. And then the process of review, in the Buddha's time, the Buddha says that one recites, this is the third step, is one recites them verbally. What one has learned and retained in mind, one recites verbally. And this was done always during the Buddha's time in order to ensure that the teachings would be retained and preserved and then transmitted to the next generation. And even today in countries like Sri Lanka and in Burma and maybe Thailand, the monastics will memorize the teachings. In fact, there was a Burmese, when I visited Sri Lanka in 2006, it was like a group of monks. We did like we went to visit some of the sacred places in Sri Lanka, the sacred Buddhist places, and there was a Burmese monk on that tour who was maybe roughly my age, maybe even younger than myself, but he was what they call it, Tripitaka Dara, which means he's memorized the whole Tripitaka. Yeah, his name was Venerable Gundamala. And then when I joined the monks who did the Walk for Peace, I joined them in Washington, D.C. And then at the closing ceremony, the Lincoln Memorial, the speaker introduced, there were some guest monks who had come to be the speakers, and he invited one of the monks to give a little speech. I heard the name Gundamala, and when he finished his speech, he was passing me by, and then I called him and I said, "Were you in Sri Lanka on that pilgrimage in 2006? He said, "Yes, I was there." And so now we have a Tripitaka now living in the United States. I think he's at a Burmese monastery in Texas.
City. Which city?
It might be Dallas or Austin, I'm not sure. Anyway, so this is the third step in learning, is to practice reciting the text. That's the way one imprints the text on the memory. Then that's not enough, because you can memorize the text, but the computer can do the same thing. But now we have to go to understanding. So the fourth step is that you investigate the meaning. So in this case, you have to start looking into the meaning of the text. And a good way to go about this, and this is what I did in those early days when I was studying the suttas in Sri Lanka as a young monk, what I would do is to make lists of important topics that I would come across in reading the suttas, and then I would classify the different suttas that I was reading under those lists of topics so that I would get all of the references to particular topics into a set of just notes. And that way I could see, sort of draw out the interconnections, relationships between the different teachings, and see how the teachings sort of fit together into what I would call the architecture of the Dharma. And so I sort of used that scheme that I developed back those days. If you know the book that I compiled, the anthology called In the Buddha's Words, it's an anthology of suttas from the Pali Canon. So that sort of reflects the scheme of categories that I used back in 1973, 1974, when I was reading the Pali Canon for the first time. Okay, so that's the fourth step, is investigating the meaning, examining the meaning. And then the fifth step is penetrating the meaning with view, with insight. And that fifth step of learning takes us to the fifth kind of wealth that the Buddha speaks of, and this is wisdom. And the sutta explains this as the wisdom that sees arising and passing away. So this is where you're actually moving from the intellectual understanding of the Dhamma into the meditative penetration of the truth of the teaching through gaining the insight, the initial insight into anicca or impermanence. So here we move into the meditative practice. After one develops a certain degree of stability of mind through concentration exercises, then one starts to investigate the five aggregates into which the Buddha classifies the components of human experience, usually beginning with the body, with material form, seeing the arising and passing of material phenomena, and then moving into the mental side of experience, the side of cognition, seeing the arising and passing of feelings, perceptions or ideation, volitional formations, and even consciousness, till one is seeing into the arising and passing away of all the five aggregates. And that becomes the insight into impermanence. And even if one doesn't go beyond the insight into impermanence, but one just develops that insight into impermanence, and the Buddha in that sutta, he says that this insight into arising and vanishing, he says, this is noble and penetrative, leading to the complete extinction of dukkha. So that is the insight that leads to liberation. So even we don't have to be concerned that we're not arriving at these powerful world mind transforming insights that turn the mind upside down. But even if we just begin by initial reflections on, even we could do as intellectual contemplations or reflections on impermanence, looking into the five aggregates and just reflecting that this bodily form is impermanent, all my feelings, pleasant, painful, neutral, are impermanent, all my perceptions and ideas are impermanent, all my intentions and purposes are impermanent, and even consciousness itself is impermanent. And then from there, one could reflect. I like to jump immediately to the reflective contemplation of non-self, that this body is not mine, not I. Feelings, not mine, not I. Perceptions, volitional formations, consciousness, not mine, not I, not myself. So even if one is not gaining very powerful, transformative, meditative insights. But if one is just doing this as a daily reflective contemplation, one is building up, we call this the seeds of wisdom in one's mind. Okay, so these are the 5 sources of wealth. Just to review: faith, and that's faith in the enlightenment of the Buddha, taking the Buddha as one's supreme teacher and his Dharma as the guide to your own enlightenment. Then transforming one's conduct by following sila, the precepts, and developing the virtues that correspond to the precepts, practicing generosity to break down that that wall of attachment, of wall of separation between yourself and others, and bringing concrete benefits to others in very tangible ways through giving, and then to descend into the depths of the Dhamma, learning the teachings by taking whatever basic texts. I see here hundreds of books, it seems, in this center, so you can many texts to read. But even if you're not going to read a lot of texts, but you can start, what I advise people to do often is to take a book like the Dhammapada and read 1 chapter a day. And it takes like 5 minutes to read 1 chapter, and read it out loud, of course, to yourself. And so in a month, you could go through the Dhammapada, and then once you finish it one time, read through it again. And really, as I said, just 5 minutes a day, you're investing in learning the Dhammapada. And then you go through it again and again, it becomes deeply imprinted into your mind so that it becomes absorbed into your whole life, then becomes sort of structured around the teachings of the Dhammapada. So this is learning, and then wisdom. Of course, if you have the chance to do like intensive meditation retreats, where you learn how to practice samatha meditation to concentrate the mind, and then insight meditation to gain the insights into the anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanent, suffering, non-self. In this way, you'll be gathering this 5 sources of wealth. And then at the end of the sutta, the Buddha has a number of verses in which he sort of summarizes the teaching on the 5 kinds of wealth. And then the verse ends by saying, one who has these 5 qualities, faith, sila, generosity, learning, and wisdom, if you have these, we can say that your life is not poor, that one has not lived a meaningless life. So if you want to live a life rich in meaning, plant your faith in the enlightenment of the Buddha, in the 3 precious jewels, live a life governed by the precepts, practice generosity, learn the Dhamma, even if you just have a limited amount of time to devote to learning each day, and practice, at least devote some period of meditation to start planting the seeds of calm and insight, samatha and vipassana. And your life will be very rich in meaning and value. Okay, maybe with this, then I could end my talk and just leave some time. Maybe we have about 15 minutes for questions.